All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. For all you future diplomats out there and global affairs gurus, this one's especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC exam, especially that international relations section.
Yeah, definitely a must listen.
But even if you're not taking the exam,
Mm.
this deep dive is a fantastic way to level up your understanding of how the world works.
Absolutely.
We're going to be tackling different views of history,
Yeah.
realist, liberal, and all those critical approaches.
Yeah. And these perspectives, they're like a secret decoder ring for global events.
Oh, I like that.
It's about going beyond just, the facts and dates
Right.
and getting into the why, the underlying forces and motivations that really shape the world.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And trust me, that kind of analytical thinking, that's pure gold for the UPSC.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the realist. Now, our source material doesn't sugarcoat things. It basically says, hey, history repeats itself. Humans are kind of obsessed with power.
Mhm.
And conflict is basically baked into the system.
Right.
There's this line that really stuck with me. History, if you like, does not move forward. Rather, it repeats itself endlessly. It's pretty intense, right? I mean, is it all doom and gloom?
Well, it's not about pessimism. It's more about being pragmatic.
Okay.
Realists see this cyclical view of history as a way to understand the present and anticipate the future.
Okay.
They believe states are always trying to gain an edge, and cooperation, it's often temporary, a way to achieve a specific goal. Think about it. How many times have we seen conflicts erupt over resources, security, or influence?
Yeah, it's a pretty common theme throughout history.
Exactly. A realist would say, look, this isn't new. This is the same patterns playing out over and over again.
So for realists, understanding these historical power dynamics is key to navigating the international arena.
For sure.
But wouldn't that lead to a very, cynical approach to diplomacy and international relations? I mean, where's the room for progress if everything's just a power struggle?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of the realist perspective. They wouldn't necessarily say there's no room for progress,
Right.
but they'd argue that it happens within the constraints of this power-driven system.
I see.
Realists would say, let's be realistic about what's achievable.
Okay.
They'd focus on understanding those constraints and working within them to advance national interests. And, that's a perspective you'll often see reflected in foreign policy decisions, even today.
Okay, I see where they're coming from. It's all about playing the game strategically, right?
Yeah.
But now let's flip the script and look at the liberal view. Our source material paints a much more optimistic picture here.
Right. Definitely. Liberals believe in progress. They see humanity as capable of learning from its mistakes and moving towards a more peaceful and cooperative world.
Yeah.
The text highlights this idea of reason being a driving force, leading to things like stronger economic ties between nations and the development of international law.
Right.
Think about it, the very existence of the UN international courts and all these global agreements,
Yeah.
it's a testament to this belief that we can work together to solve problems.
And there's a line in the text that really captures this. A transition from power-seeking behavior to a condition characterized by cooperation and peaceful coexistence. It's almost like a completely different world from the realist perspective.
Right, but it's important to remember that liberalism isn't naive.
Hmm.
It recognizes that progress isn't a straight line.
Right.
Think about the period after World War I.
Oh, yeah.
There was so much hope. The League of Nations was formed,
Right.
but then we had the devastating World War II, or even more recently, the optimism after the Cold War,
Right.
followed by new threats like terrorism.
So it's not all sunshine and rainbows. But liberals still believe in the power of international institutions and norms to promote peace and cooperation.
Yeah.
Even in the face of these setbacks.
Absolutely. And that's a key point to remember, especially for the UPSC.
Right.
Questions about global governance,
Right.
the effectiveness of the UN, the role of international law.
Yeah.
These are all areas where understanding the liberal perspective is crucial.
It's like this ongoing tension between idealism and reality.
Yeah.
Liberals are pushing for a better world, but they're also grappling with the complexities and challenges of actually getting there. Okay, before I move on, I have to ask.
Yeah.
What about those times when international institutions fail to prevent conflict or address a crisis? How would a liberal explain that?
That's where the liberal perspective gets really interesting. They would likely argue that those failures don't invalidate the overall goal,
Okay.
but rather highlight the need to strengthen these institutions, reform them, adapt them to new challenges. And, this is where you can get into some really nuanced arguments and analysis, which is exactly what the UPSC examiners are looking for.
That's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork with the realist and liberal perspectives. But hold on, because we're about to enter the realm of critical views, and let me tell you, things are about to get seriously thought-provoking.
For sure. We're moving beyond simply looking at states and power dynamics
Okay.
and diving into the deep end, exploring how factors like economics, social structures, and even ideas themselves shape history.
All right, so buckle up, everyone. The text focuses mainly on Marxism, but it also mentions things like poststructuralism, feminism, and social constructivism. What makes these approaches so critical? I mean, it sounds a bit intimidating.
Don't worry, it's not about being judgmental. It's about questioning assumptions, challenging traditional narratives, and looking at history from different angles. And let me tell you, this is where you can really impress those UPSC examiners. They love to see candidates who can go beyond the mainstream and demonstrate a deeper understanding of these critical perspectives.
Okay, so let's break down Marxism. The text mentions this idea of historical materialism. What exactly does that mean, and how does it apply to understanding international relations?
Well, historical materialism, it's all about understanding how economic forces shape history and society. Marxists believe that the way goods are produced and distributed, the economic system fundamentally influences everything else, from politics and culture to international relations.
So instead of focusing on states as the main actors, Marxists are looking at the economic systems that underpin those states and how those systems create relationships of power and inequality.
Exactly. And that leads to the concept of class struggle, which Marxists see as a recurring theme throughout history. They argue that inherent tensions exist between those who control the means of production, the factories, the land, the capital, and those who don't. So while realists focus on power struggles between states, Marxists dig deeper into the power dynamics within societies and how those dynamics play out on a global scale.
So for a Marxist, a conflict between two countries might not just be about territory or resources, but also about deeper economic interests and the struggle for control over global systems of production.
You got it. Now think about how this applies to a topic like colonialism. A realist might see it as a straightforward competition for power and resources. But a Marxist would argue that it was driven by the expansion of capitalist systems seeking new markets and cheap labor.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. It's
Yeah.
like peeling back another layer of the onion and seeing those economic forces driving historical events. And the text mentions that Marxism isn't the only critical lens out there.
Right. You have poststructuralism, which challenges the very idea of objective truth and explores how language and discourse shape our understanding of history. Feminism highlights the experiences and perspectives of women which are often marginalized in traditional historical narratives. And social constructivism focuses on how ideas and norms, rather than just material forces, shape international relations.
Okay, so we've got realism focusing on state power, liberalism, emphasizing cooperation and progress, and this whole array of critical views that dig deeper into the underlying structures and assumptions. Now, here's the million-dollar question for our UPSC aspirants. How do we actually apply these different perspectives to analyze real-world events? I mean, it's one thing to understand the theory, but how do we use it to craft those insightful answers that examiners love?
That's where things get really interesting, and trust me, this is where you can really shine in the UPSC. Let's take a concrete example that's super relevant to international relations, the rise of China.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's put on our realist hats for a moment. How would they view China's growing influence on the global stage?
Well, as you might expect, realists tend to see this as a textbook case of power dynamics shifting. They'd point to China's increasing military capabilities, its assertive actions in the South China Sea, and its economic expansion through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. They say, look, China is acting rationally to secure its interests and increase its power within the international system.
It's that classic realist focus on self-interest and the pursuit of power playing out on a global scale.
Okay, now let's switch to the liberal lens. How would they interpret China's rise? Liberals would probably acknowledge the potential for tension and competition, but they'd also emphasize the importance of engagement and cooperation with China. They'd advocate for strengthening international institutions and norms to manage this shift in power peacefully. They might even argue that economic interdependence between China and other major powers could act as a deterrent against conflict.
So a more optimistic outlook, focusing on finding common ground and working within the existing system. Now, I'm really curious to hear how a critical theorist, especially from a Marxist perspective, would approach this.
Here's where we get into some really insightful analysis. A Marxist would likely focus on the economic underpinnings of China's rise. They'd look at the role of globalization, the exploitation of labor in Chinese factories, and the integration of China into the global capitalist system. They might even argue that China's success is, in a way, reinforcing the very inequalities that are inherent in that system.
So instead of simply looking at state-level power dynamics, They're digging deeper into the global economic structures that are shaping these events and potentially creating new forms of inequality and exploitation.
Absolutely. And remember, the UPSC loves to see this kind of nuanced analysis. It shows that you're not just regurgitating facts, but you're engaging with different schools of thought, critically evaluating arguments, and forming your own informed opinions.
All right, so we've explored realism, liberalism, and all those thought-provoking critical views. But where do we go from here? What can these perspectives tell us about the future of international relations?
Well, it's like trying to predict the weather, right?
Yeah.
But instead of, clouds and wind, we've got power dynamics and ideologies swirling around.
Right, it's a bit more complicated than just checking the forecast.
Definitely complex.
Yeah.
But these different lenses can help us make sense of the trends shaping the world. Think about it. Technology is advancing at an incredible pace. Climate change is a looming threat. The global population is shifting and growing.
Yeah, a lot of moving parts.
Each perspective offers a unique take on how these forces might play out on the international stage.
Okay, so let's start with our pragmatic realists. What's their forecast for the future?
Well, as you might expect, realists tend to see the future as an extension of the past. They'd argue that power struggles between states will continue to be the defining feature of international relations.
Okay, so more of the claim.
Yeah, competition for resources, economic dominance, military superiority, these will remain the driving forces of global politics.
So a world where national interests come first, where states are constantly maneuvering for advantage. It sounds a bit like a never-ending game of Risk, but with real-world consequences.
Exactly. And while realists don't rule out cooperation entirely, they
Okay.
tend to see it as a strategic tool, a way to achieve specific goals within a system that's ultimately defined by competition. They might even argue that as new powers like China rise, we could see more friction, more jostling for position, and potentially even a higher risk of conflict.
Okay, so maybe not the most optimistic outlook. But let's shift gears and see if our liberals offer a more hopeful vision of the future. What do they predict?
Well, liberals, with their belief in progress and human reason, tend to be more optimistic. They see a future where international institutions grow stronger, where cooperation on global challenges like climate change and pandemics becomes the norm, and where democratic values continue to spread, promoting peace and stability.
So a world where diplomacy triumphs over military force, where states find common ground and work together to address shared challenges. Sounds pretty idealistic, doesn't it?
It does, and that's one of the critiques of the liberal perspective.
Okay.
That it can be a bit too utopian, too quick to dismiss the enduring power of self-interest and the potential for conflict.
Right.
But liberals would counter that even if progress is slow and sometimes uneven, it's still a goal worth striving for.
Okay, so we have realists predicting a future shaped by power struggles and liberals envisioning a more cooperative world. Now, I'm really curious to hear what our critical theorists have to say. They always bring such a unique perspective to the table.
They do, and in this case, they'd likely focus on the underlying structures and systems that they believe drive global events. Critical theorists, particularly those with a Marxist lens, might argue that the future will be shaped by the inherent contradictions of capitalism, leading to greater inequality, social unrest, and potentially even major upheaval.
So instead of focusing solely on interactions between states, they're looking at the global economic system and how it distributes wealth, power, and resources.
Precisely. They might point to things like the widening gap between the rich and the poor, the exploitation of workers in developing countries, and the environmental consequences of unchecked economic growth as evidence of these contradictions playing out on a global scale.
It's a perspective that challenges us to think beyond traditional notions of state power and consider how these deeper systemic issues might shape the future.
Exactly. And remember, none of these perspectives has a crystal ball. The future is uncertain and complex.
Right, it's not like we have all the answers.
But by understanding these different lenses, by being able to analyze events from multiple angles, we can start to make more informed judgments about the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
It's like having a toolkit full of different analytical instruments. You wouldn't use a hammer for every job, right? The same goes for understanding international relations. You need the right tool for the job, and sometimes you need to use multiple tools to get a complete picture.
And that's especially important for UPSC aspirants. The examiners aren't looking for candidates who can simply regurgitate facts or parrot a single perspective.
Right.
They want to see critical thinking, nuanced analysis, and the ability to engage with different schools of thought.
So, dear listener, as you continue your UPSC journey and delve deeper into the fascinating world of international relations, remember this. Don't be afraid to challenge assumptions, question the status quo, and explore different perspectives. Because in a world as complex and interconnected as ours, the ability to think critically and analyze events from multiple angles is truly a superpower.
And who knows, maybe by understanding these different lenses, we can even start to shape a future that's a little bit brighter, a little bit more peaceful, and a little bit more just...
Now that's something worth striving for. And hey, if you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to like and subscribe for more insightful explorations of the world around us. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep diving deep.